Hello everybody, this is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday afternoon, September 29th, and this will be the announcement for week 7 of Con Law, Political Science 3753 for the fall 2024 term. Alright everybody, what we have this week is, it's Sunday the 29th. Tomorrow and Tuesday, September 30th and October 1st, we'll be doing our third discussion. Okay, and I want to say a few words about that. Later in the week, on Friday the 4th, we'll be taking our midterm exam. So I need to say a few words about all that and also talk a little bit about our last material, our last set of class notes before the midterm exam on federalism. Okay. The discussion has to do with federalism and voting rights. Now, we've already taken a quiz in which we've covered, we asked you to look at South Carolina versus Katzenbach from back in the 1960s, in which the Supreme Court signed off on the Voting Rights Act. Okay, well, voting rights continue to be an issue in federalism, especially in the wake of the 2020 election and with 2024, of course, coming up in a few weeks. After the passage of the 14th Amendment, and especially after legislation was passed in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, okay, the relation between the feds and the states in this area was significantly changed, but the states still administered the elections. Okay, so this raises some questions. South Carolina versus Katzenbach ratified effectively the Voting Rights Act. But some people think the Voting Rights Act was compromised by a subsequent decision from a decade or two ago in the Shelby County case, which I discussed in the announcement that went out. And we asked you to take a look at a couple of pro and con articles about election administration and the relation between the feds and the states in that area. I mentioned in that announcement for the discussion, when we talk about federalism issues, we're often talking about economic regulation. But it also comes up in this area of basic citizenship rights, such as voting rights. So think about where you stand with regard to who ought to have authority over voting rights, the feds vis-a-vis the states. It's a sort of a live issue and kind of a hand grenade in American politics as things stand right now. We've got an election coming up, and we just don't know if everybody's going to accept the results of the election the way things are going. You're in about a little over 5 weeks on November 5th. That's a very topical issue. So we'll be discussing that. So take a look at that announcement I sent out in the 2 articles I asked you to look at with the links. We'll be talking about that tomorrow and Tuesday, the 30th and the 1st for our third discussion, and then that will give us 3 quizzes and 3 discussions before the midterm. And then after that, we'll do 4 more discussions and 4 quizzes for the final. We don't divide the course quite exactly in half. We had 12 sets of class notes before midterm, and we'll have 15 more before the final exam. We start out with basics about the federalism, the powers of the president and Congress, system of checks and balances, and some basics about how the constitutional system operates. Then in the second part of the course after midterm, we'll be talking largely about civil rights and liberties, beginning right after the midterm exam. The midterm will be Friday the 4th for 24 hours, 50 true, false, and multiple choice items. The material will be the class notes for lectures 1 through 12, those 12 sets of class notes, and also expect maybe 10 or 12 of the quiz items to be repeated. So please go back carefully and look at the material you were assigned for quizzes 1, 2, and 3. Okay, because a good bit of it will come from that, and beyond that, it'll be on the class notes from lectures 1 through 12 that should have been looking at all along. All right, so the discussion will take place Monday, tomorrow, and Tuesday, the 30th and the 1st, and then the midterm on Friday the 4th. Looking very quickly at our last material before the midterm exam on federalism, the class notes for lectures 11 and 12. In lecture 11, We largely talked about the case of McCullough versus Maryland, going back to 1819. This concerned the establishment of the second bank of the United States. There had been a first bank. The idea of having a national bank was a Hamiltonian idea. Hamilton was dead by now, killed in the duel with Aaron Burr. But his colleague Madison was president by now, and it was really largely under his impetus that the second bank of the United States was established. Not all the states trusted the operations of either the first or the second bank of the United States. There was opposition to it. And the state of Maryland intervened, and the idea of the people in Maryland was that they would try to tax the operations of the Bank of the United States so they would be forced to go out of business. That's where we get the idea that the power to tax is the power to destroy. It goes back to McCullough versus Maryland. Well, Chief Justice Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled that yes, Congress did have the authority to establish a Bank of the United States, and Maryland did not have the authority to tax it. Okay. Maryland, in effect, was attempting to destroy the Bank of the United States on behalf of all the states. But the voters outside of Maryland had no say over what Maryland did. One state cannot undo something like that for the whole Union. So Maryland was arrogating into itself power it really shouldn't be allowed to have, said Marshall, in the case of McCullough versus Maryland. So it was a nationalizing decision that affirmed the power of the government of the United States to act in the national interest, the broad interpretation of the powers that the feds had been given under the Constitution. Another important case to look at is the Dartmouth College case from the same year, 1819. And what the Dartmouth College case did was it helped to establish the legal personality of the corporation. And that's an important development in American history. We tend to look at corporations as something like individuals with rights that cannot be violated. It's a controversial proposition. We can trace that back at least to the Dartmouth College case, Dartmouth College versus Woodward, 1819. All right, so a couple of very important things to look at in Lecture 11. And we talk in general, as that lecture winds to an end, about Marshall's constitutionalism, and especially his interpretation of the Commerce Clause, his broad interpretation of the powers of the federal government. Right. Then in the second part, Lecture 12, we go back to that New Deal period, okay, and the change in the relation between the feds and the states that was ushered in by the New Deal. Changes that the current Supreme Court may be interested in looking at revising or reining in or even rolling back. But be that as it may, those New Deal era cases are important. And we talked about that last week when we were looking at the commerce power, and we touch on that again. Important cases to look at from 1941 and 42, U.S. versus Darby and Wickard versus Filburn are a couple of cases. They culminate a series of cases in which the Supreme Court essentially ratified the New Deal. Okay. Wickard versus Filburn is one that's always raised a lot of eyebrows. In that case, the court signed off on the idea that grain was in interstate commerce even if it never left the farm and was used for animal feed. Okay. Well, had it not been used for animal feed, that would have had to been purchased on the open market, so it was really part of commerce. Something that raised a lot of eyebrows before and since. There are still those who have a problem with Wickard versus Filburn. But that was one of the series of cases going from 37 to 41 and 42 in which the Supreme Court essentially signed off on the New Deal. We had you look at for the quiz the case of Garcia versus San Antonio. Garcia versus the San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority. That case in 1985, one in which the Supreme Court reversed itself from less than a decade earlier in the case of National League of Cities versus Usury. The question was, could the federal government regulate wages, hours, and working conditions for state and local government employees? Okay. At first, in 1976, the court said no, they could not, because that would damage the system of federalism. But then in 1985, in the Garcia case, what the Supreme Court says is that what protects federalism is the structure of the Constitution, including some things that are controversial these days, the Senate and the Electoral College. But the Supreme Court in 1985 said it was that Congress could regulate state and local government employment, but what was protecting the system of federalism was the framework set up in the Constitution, including the Senate and the Electoral College. Now, some other interesting cases that raise federalism issues: South Dakota versus Dole from 1987, in which the Supreme Court effectively let the feds regulate the drinking age nationwide. Okay. States could establish an 18-year-old drinking age if they wished, but they would lose their federal highway funds. And those highway funds amounted to an offer the states could not refuse. NFIB versus Sebelius. That's the case in which the Supreme Court signed off on Obamacare, but said that the states did not have to take part in the expansion of Medicaid. They could decline to take part in that and not lose their federal Medicaid funds, because the feds were going to fund that expansion for 3 years, but then the states would be on the hook after that. And several of the states did not want to do that. So the court accepted the constitutionality of Obamacare, but did not require the states to take part in the expansion of Medicaid on pain of losing their federal Medicaid funds. Then also, at the very end of those notes, we did talk once again about South Carolina versus Katzenbach, which we quizzed you on last week. We had you look at, and it comes up for our discussion this week as well. All right, so federalism issues, class notes for lectures 11 and 12. We'll end the material for the midterm exam on Friday. Be sure you have looked thoroughly at the class notes for lectures 1 through 12, going back to the beginning of the term, and also the material we quizzed you on in quizzes 1, 2, and 3. Then tomorrow and Tuesday, okay, the 30th and the 1st, we'll do our last discussion before the midterm, discussion number 3, about federalism and voting rights. We've asked you to look at a couple of things, including some articles that we've linked to that amount to pro and con commentaries about the voting rights issue as the 2024 election approaches. Okay, everybody. I hope that will leave you in good shape for the midterm exam. Contact me with any problems, questions, or issues through the website or at david.cole@opsu.edu. So hope you'll take part in the discussion enthusiastically. And good luck to you on the exam. Study hard, take it easy. We'll talk to you once again about a week from now at this time, when we'll be through with the midterm and we'll be moving on to such issues as the right to privacy and abortion, which we know were a big stumbling block, a big issue as American politics goes forward as the 2024 election approaches. So good luck on the exam. We'll be talking to you again after the exam about a week from now at this time.